At midnight in 1947, the British didn't just leave India, they almost broke it in half. Most people think the story of modern South Asia begins with independence. It doesn't. It begins with a line on a map, a line that, once drawn, hardwired suspicion, war, and duplication into the future of nearly 2 billion people. So here's the question no one ever asks. What if that line was never drawn? What if India stayed whole? No Pakistan, no Bangladesh, and the subcontinent entered the modern world as a single continental state. This isn't fantasy. There's no magic technology, no perfect leaders, no utopia. Just one decision not made, and 79 years of consequences compounding like interest. Because when a quarter of humanity grows up inside one political system, history doesn't unfold the same way. It bends. The story doesn't begin with independence. It begins with something far rarer in history than freedom. It begins with restraint. In 1947, the British leave behind a subcontinent holding roughly 400 million people, speaking over 1,000 languages, practicing every major religion on Earth, and carrying centuries of unresolved tension. In most versions of history, this is where the fracture happens. Borders are drawn, states are carved. Violence becomes a release valve, but in this world that valve never opens. India remains one. No partition, no Pakistan, no Bangladesh, no sudden redrawing of rivers, railways, ports or supply chains. And the immediate consequence is not peace or prosperity. It is pressure. Enormous grinding pressure, pressing inward from every direction. Most people underestimate how unnatural this is. Empires break apart because scale multiplies friction. When Britain ruled India, it ruled by distance, hierarchy and selective neglect. When India rules itself, it must rule by proximity. Every grievance is now domestic, every riot is internal, every failure has nowhere else to go. In the first years after independence, the Indian state is fragile in ways that don't show up on maps. Literacy is low, revenue is thin, industry is shallow, the bureaucracy is large but trained for obedience, not initiative. And yet, there is one decisive advantage that almost never appears in textbooks: continuity. Without partition, India inherits the entire colonial skeleton intact. The railways remain unified. The irrigation systems of Punjab still feed the same markets. Calcutta remains connected to its hinterland. Bombay keeps its trade routes. The merchant networks that once spanned the subcontinent do not suddenly become foreign. Capital does not flee across newly invented borders. It hesitates, but it stays. That hesitation matters. Most post-colonial states begin life bleeding. India begins life bruised, but whole. The military is the first institution to feel the difference. In our world, partition shattered regiments overnight. Soldiers woke up as foreigners. Supply depots were split by hurried arithmetic. Command structures were amputated. In this world, nothing is cut. The Indian Army remains unified, experienced, and large. By 1950, it is already one of the biggest standing forces on Earth. Not because India wants war, but because it inherits one of the largest armies the British Empire ever assembled. And crucially, it inherits its memory. That memory includes World War II, where Indian troops fought across North Africa, Italy, and Southeast Asia. It includes logistics on a continental scale. It includes coordination across climates and languages. This is not a rebel force becoming an army. It is an army becoming sovereign. Most people think military power comes from weapons. In reality, it comes from institutions that survive stress. India's army does. The early Cold War takes notice. Washington sees a potential ally but hesitates. India is too large to control, too opinionated to command. Moscow sees a potential partner but understands the limits. India is socialist in rhetoric but deeply allergic to subordination. The result is something new. A country that doesn't balance between blocks so much as force them to orbit around it. Geography does the rest. A united India controls the northern rim of the Indian Ocean, a fact that sounds abstract until you realize how much of the world's trade flows through it. Even in the 1950s, oil from the Middle East to East Asia passes within reach of Indian ports. Sea lanes that connect Europe to Asia bend around the subcontinent like gravity wells. India doesn't need to project power outward. Its location does it automatically. This changes how diplomacy works. Treaties become quieter. Pressure becomes subtler. No one wants to push too hard against a state that can, in theory, choke global trade without firing a shot. Internally, the challenges are relentless. Linguistic movements flare, religious mistrust simmers, regional elites resist centralization. The state responds not with speed, but with absorption. States are reorganized by language rather than force. Power is devolved unevenly. Some regions thrive, others stagnate, inequality hardens into geography. But here's the counterintuitive part. The absence of partition delays civil war. Most people assume diversity makes states unstable. Often it does, but fragmentation creates zero-sum stakes instantly. In this India, every faction understands something important. There is no exit, no new country waiting on the other side of the argument. That knowledge changes behavior. Conflicts don't vanish, they stretch, they grind, they exhaust themselves. Meanwhile, the economy begins its long, unglamorous climb. India does not industrialize quickly. It industrializes deliberately. Heavy industry is prioritized over consumer goods, steel over sneakers, power plants over profit margins. The logic is defensive. A country this large cannot afford dependency. Most people don't realize that early economic inefficiency can sometimes be strategic. India is buying resilience, not growth charts. By the 1960s, the internal market alone is staggering. Even modest per capita consumption multiplied by hundreds of millions creates scale effects that no external shock can easily collapse. Famines still occur, but distribution improves faster than production. Transportation saves more lives than agriculture. Then comes the northern frontier. China's consolidation of Tibet is no longer a distant issue. It is a shared border problem touching a unified India with deeper logistics, larger reserves, and a population that dwarfs any single adversary. Tensions rise, roads are built earlier, airstrips appear where maps once showed nothing. The Himalayas stop being a philosophical boundary and become a strategic one. When clashes occur, they are sharp but contained. There is no sudden humiliation, no dramatic collapse. The war ends without victory, and that matters more than victory ever could. India's leadership emerges convinced of one thing: security cannot be outsourced. Defense spending rises steadily, not frantically. Research institutions expand. Missile programs begin quietly. Nuclear theory moves from academic to practical, not because India is threatened tomorrow, but because it knows it will exist a century from now. By the end of the Cold War's first act, India is something no one predicted in 1947. Not a superpower, not a client, but a continental state that survived its most dangerous moment by refusing to split, and in doing so altered the strategic geometry of the entire world. And this is only the beginning. By the late 1970s, the arithmetic of a united India starts to feel unreal. The population crosses 650 million people. That is more humans living under a single flag than the entire Western Hemisphere at the time. Most people struggle to visualize scale at that level, so here's a quiet reframing. Every 4 years, this India adds a population roughly equal to France. Every decade, it adds a Japan. And unlike frontier states that expand outward, this growth stacks inward, compressing cities, villages, transport, and politics into an ever denser system. Economically, the headline numbers look deceptively modest. India's GDP in the late 1970s sits around $400 billion in today's adjusted terms. That sounds small until you realize what it represents. This is not a consumer economy. This is an economy where per capita income is low, but aggregate demand is colossal. A small increase in productivity translates into tens of millions of additional meals, shoes, light bulbs, and bus tickets every single day. Most people don't realize that India becomes one of the world's largest energy consumers without ever becoming energy rich. Coal dominates. Hydroelectric dams stretch across river systems that never crossed borders. Nuclear plants begin appearing near the coasts, built less for prestige and more for stability. Rolling blackouts are common, but nationwide collapse never happens. The grid bends, but it doesn't break. Daily life for the average Indian is still hard. Most families live in multi-generational households. Refrigerators are rare outside cities. Scooters outnumber cars by orders of magnitude. But there's a subtle shift compared to our world. Migration patterns are internal, not external. Instead of millions crossing borders to become refugees or expatriates, they move from Bihar to Punjab, from Bengal to Bombay, from villages into megacities that swell rather than fracture. Cities change shape. Calcutta remains enormous but less hollowed out. Bombay grows faster, absorbing textile workers who never lost their northern markets. Karachi never becomes a rival port because it never exists as a foreign one. Instead, India's western coastline develops as a continuous commercial belt. By the 1980s, the combined urban population of Bombay, Ahmedabad, Surat and Pune rivals New York and Los Angeles combined. Delhi becomes something different entirely, not just a capital but a demographic mirror of the entire country. Walk through its streets and you hear nearly every major language spoken in the subcontinent. It is chaotic, polluted, overstretched, and politically unavoidable. Power in India doesn't concentrate in one city. It circulates. Nowhere is this more visible than in the military. By the 1980s, India maintains an active duty force of over 2 million personnel, with reserves pushing the total toward 5 million. To put that into perspective, that's larger than the combined militaries of Western Europe. And unlike conscript-heavy forces elsewhere, a large portion of India's military is experienced, trained and permanently mobilizable due to internal security demands. Defense spending remains around 3% of GDP, which sounds moderate until you multiply it by continental scale. India is producing its own rifles, artillery, tanks, and eventually aircraft. Not always cutting edge, but reliable, replaceable, domestic. Most people don't realize how rare that is. Many countries can build advanced weapons. Few can build them in bulk without foreign supply chains. India can. Nuclear capability quietly locks this in. Without a hostile neighbour forcing urgency, India's nuclear doctrine matures slowly. When the arsenal becomes public, it's already survivable. Not massive, but credible. Enough to make any external coercion mathematically irrational. Meanwhile, life expectancy climbs. Literacy doubles. Television spreads faster than ideology. A single state broadcaster reaches hundreds of millions nightly, shaping a shared narrative across religions and regions. Cricket becomes more than a sport, it becomes a statistical obsession. When India fields a team, the audience is larger than the population of the United States. Here's a number that rarely gets mentioned. By the early 1990s, this India produces more engineers annually than the entire OECD combined. Most don't work in tech. They work in railways, power plants, factories, and municipal offices. Bureaucracy becomes technical. Slow, yes, but competent at scale. When economic liberalization finally arrives, it doesn't feel like a revolution. It feels like a release. Controls loosen, capital flows faster, services explode, software becomes exportable. By the early 2000s, India's GDP crosses $2 trillion in real terms, driven not by miracle growth rates but by sheer accumulation. Average daily life improves unevenly but noticeably. Electricity becomes more reliable. Mobile phones spread faster than landlines ever did. A farmer checks prices before selling. A factory worker sends money home instantly. A student in a small town watches the same movies as someone in Mumbai on the same week they release. The most surprising shift is psychological. This India does not see itself as catching up. It sees itself as unfolding. People argue constantly about corruption, inequality, congestion and governance, but rarely about legitimacy. The state is assumed to endure. Elections matter because everyone expects to be here afterward. By the early 21st century, India's economy is larger than Japan's was at its peak in real purchasing power. Its military footprint spans from the Persian Gulf to Southeast Asia. Its diaspora shapes industries abroad while remaining anchored at home. And its cities, chaotic as they are, never hollow out into shells. Most people think power announces itself with spectacle. This version of India doesn't. It accumulates quietly, relentlessly, until the numbers themselves become impossible to ignore. And that accumulation sets the stage for something far more dangerous than poverty or war. Expectation. Because once a country contains 1 out of every 5 humans on Earth, the question stops being whether it matters. The question becomes what happens when it finally decides how much. To understand how this united India reshapes the modern world, you have to rewind to the Middle East of the 1980s, because that's where the ripple first becomes visible. The Iran-Iraq War still erupts in 1980. The ideologies are unchanged. The border disputes are unchanged. The brutality is unchanged. What changes is the environment surrounding the war. In this world, India is already one of the largest energy importers on Earth, And unlike Western powers, it is not distant. It sits directly across the Indian Ocean, with shipping routes, port infrastructure, and millions of economic touchpoints tied to Gulf stability. That alone alters incentives. Oil tankers in the Persian Gulf are no longer just Western assets. They are carrying fuel critical to a state that represents hundreds of millions of people and a growing industrial base. Insurance markets price that reality in. Shipping firms price it in. Gulf monarchies price it in. Suddenly, escalation that threatens maritime traffic doesn't just antagonize the United States or Europe, it risks destabilizing the largest emerging market in the world. India doesn't stop the war, but it quietly helps cap it. Naval patrols expand earlier. Not aggressively, not symbolically, routinely. Indian vessels become a normal presence near key sea lanes, framed as trade protection rather than power projection. That framing matters. It allows Gulf states to tolerate, even welcome, Indian involvement without triggering ideological backlash. India isn't there to reshape regimes, it's there because it cannot afford chaos. This sets a precedent. By the late 1980s, Gulf states begin diversifying their external relationships earlier than in our timeline. The United States remains dominant, but it is no longer singular. India becomes a second anchor, a massive buyer of oil, a source of labor, and a stabilizing maritime presence that doesn't come bundled with Cold War ideology. Then comes 1990. Iraq invades Kuwait. The shock still reverberates globally. The United States still assembles a coalition. The Gulf War still happens. But the strategic backdrop is different. India by now has millions of citizens working across the Gulf, sending remittances home at a scale that quietly props up its balance of payments. Evacuating them becomes one of the largest civilian airlift operations in history, an operation that demonstrates something critical to every government watching. India can move people at scale. Ports, airspace coordination, shipping logistics, all executed without spectacle. That capability doesn't win battles, but it wins credibility. From this point forward, Gulf rulers understand that any major conflict in their region automatically involves India, whether India wants it or not. After the war, the long shadow settles in. The Middle East enters its uneasy 1990s phase, sanctions, containment, simmering resentments, and here India's role becomes more subtle, but more consequential. It trades where others sanction cautiously. It keeps diplomatic channels open without advertising them. It becomes one of the few actors able to speak to Iran, Iraq, the Gulf monarchies, Washington and Moscow without being instantly distrusted by all sides. Most people think influence looks like leadership. In reality, influence often looks like being the last channel nobody can afford to close. Then the world snaps again in 2001. After September 11, the United States goes to Afghanistan. In our timeline, Pakistan becomes indispensable, a problematic gatekeeper holding geography hostage. In this world, that gatekeeper never exists. There is no Pakistan to balance pressure or bribe. Instead, the regional logistics picture shifts south and east. India becomes the unavoidable regional partner, not because of ideology, but because of geography, infrastructure, and scale. This does not make Afghanistan easy. Nothing does. But it changes the supply chains, intelligence flows, and long-term calculations. India has its own reasons to want extremism contained. It invests accordingly, quietly, methodically, not as an occupying force, but as a stabilizing one that plans in decades, not deployments. Now roll forward to 2003. The Iraq War becomes the first truly altered fork. The United States still debates invasion. The same confidence exists. The same fears circulate. But the coalition environment is thinner. A united India does not need to morally oppose the war to weaken it. It can oppose it structurally. It can argue credibly that a collapsed Iraq will destabilize energy markets that underpin growth across the developing world, not just Western economies. That argument carries weight precisely because India represents the future consumer base of global energy, not the past. Whether the invasion happens or not, its aftermath changes. If the invasion occurs, India becomes one of the largest non-Western stabilizers by default. Not with troops, but with reconstruction contracts, energy trade continuity, and diplomatic ballast between Iran, the Gulf, and the West. If the invasion does not occur, India is one of the reasons. because it offers Washington an alternative to unilateral dominance, regional pressure without total ownership. Either way, the Middle East drifts towards something different. Less American monopoly. More multipolar management. Iran feels this shift most strongly. Sanctions still bite, but total isolation becomes harder when a neighboring ocean power with a massive economy keeps trade trickling. That changes Iran's behavior at the margins. Less desperation, more patience, more long-term planning. The region becomes less explosive, not because tensions disappear, but because escalation has more off-ramps. By the 2010s, the effect compounds. India is now the single largest source of foreign labor in the Gulf. Its remittances are a pillar of its domestic economy. Its navy is a permanent Indian Ocean presence. Its markets absorb Gulf exports at a scale that rivals Europe. For the Middle East, India is no longer Asia. It is the neighbor across the water that will still be there in 50 years. And then we reach the mid-2020s. By 2025, this united India is economically massive, demographically unmatched and strategically unavoidable. It doesn't dominate the Middle East militarily. It dominates it structurally. Any major war now automatically factors Indian energy security, Indian citizens, Indian shipping, and Indian reaction time into the equation. And that brings us to East Asia. When the Taiwan crisis begins to crystallize around 2027, the world initially frames it the same way it always does. China versus the United States, with Japan and allies pulled in. But that framing is outdated the moment the crisis touches energy markets. Because China's economy still depends heavily on maritime energy flows through the Indian Ocean, and India sits astride those flows, not as a threat but as a fact. India does not need to declare anything. It does not need to fire a shot. The mere possibility that India could tighten, delay, or complicate those routes forces China to plan for a two-theatre reality. Concentration becomes riskier, timelines stretch, decision windows narrow. At the same time, India offers something equally powerful, a diplomatic off-ramp, a peer-level channel Beijing cannot dismiss as Western pressure, a civilizational counterweight that understands long horizons. The crisis still exists, tensions spike, markets shake, but the calculus changes. China is no longer facing a binary gamble. It is facing a geometry problem, one where winning locally may trigger pressure globally. And that is the final realization this world forces on everyone. A united India doesn't stop wars by force. It stops easy wars by making the system too heavy to move quickly. All of this flows from one decision in 1947. Not to split, not to simplify, not to escape friction, but to absorb it and let time do the work. By 2026, the cleanest way to understand a fully united India is to stop thinking India but bigger, and start thinking a continent that never got sliced open while it was still trying to stand. Partition didn't just create borders, it created habits, permanent suspicion, permanent mobilization, duplicated institutions, duplicated defense industries, duplicated infrastructure planning, and a region permanently priced like a fire hazard. Remove partition, and you don't remove conflict from South Asia. You remove the default setting of conflict. And that compounds for nearly 80 years. Now the numbers, because this is where the thought experiment becomes a physics problem. In the real world, India in the mid-2020s is roughly a $4 trillion nominal economy. Pakistan and Bangladesh together add just under another trillion. If you simply stapled them together with no other changes, you get a paper union around $5 trillion nominal. But a no-partition world doesn't just add GDP. It removes friction losses that quietly drain decades, recurring wars and crisis mobilizations, duplicated bureaucracies, duplicated security states, and a permanent risk premium that scares capital and long-horizon projects. So by 2026, a credible nominal GDP range for this united India is the high fives to low sixes in trillions, roughly 5.5 to 6.3 trillion, driven less by genius and more by boring efficiencies. Integrated freight corridors, internalized trade routes, and ports working as complementary lungs instead of rival national arteries. On purchasing power, the scale gets more brutal. In our world, India is already around $16.2 trillion in PPP terms in 2024. Add Pakistan and Bangladesh and you're already around $19 trillion PPP before you count integration gains. With integration and a lower security discount, this united bloc by 2026 plausibly operates in the low 20s, about $21 to $24 trillion PPP. That's not a brag number. That's a how much real stuff can you build and move number. Now population, because population is the engine behind both the economy and the military. In a no-partition world, the polity approaches roughly 1.8 to 1.9 billion people by the mid-2020s. An electorate so large, democracy starts sounding like civil engineering. That size is stress, yes, but it's also redundancy. Shocks hurt, but they don't kill the system. The machine keeps running. Daily life in 2026 still looks like contradictions, gleaming districts and crumbling lanes 10 minutes apart. The difference is structural. The northwest isn't a militarized edge anymore, it's an interior artery. Punjab's industrial pull runs west without border friction. Sindh's coastline isn't a separate bargaining chip, it's the Union's western face. Bengal's manufacturing belt isn't separated by currency and policy, it's plugged into the same bloodstream. Cities shift too. Karachi isn't a rival national port outside India's control, it becomes a second megaport on the Arabian Sea, a twin to Mumbai. Dhaka isn't a separate national economic miracle. It becomes an internal manufacturing megahub feeding a vast domestic market while still exporting outward. You don't get instant utopia. You get a higher floor, faster compounding, and a lower background hum of war risk. That changes everything from investor behavior to whether young men plan for uniforms or spreadsheets. Now military power, because this is where the no-partition reality stops being interesting and starts forcing everyone else to rewrite their playbooks. In our world, India already outweighs Pakistan in conventional terms. Baseline mid-2020s figures put India around 1.4 million active personnel versus Pakistan under 700,000, with India around 3,740 main battle tanks to Pakistan's 2,537, and India around 730 combat-capable aircraft to Pakistan's 452. At sea, India fields roughly 16 submarines, 11 destroyers, 16 frigates, and 2 aircraft carriers, while Pakistan fields about 8 submarines and 10 frigates. In the no-partition world, you don't just add those numbers, you remove the most dangerous dynamic South Asia has. 2 large militaries designed to stare at each other forever. But even on pure arithmetic, the unified baseline becomes massive. Roughly 6,277 main battle tanks, roughly 1,182 combat-capable aircraft, and roughly 24 submarines before you even talk upgrades or doctrinal shifts. And the geographic multiplier is the real kicker. This India doesn't merely have a navy. It sits on the Indian Ocean's critical plumbing, energy and trade routes linking the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. A fleet that can credibly protect or credibly complicate those routes doesn't need to conquer anything to change everyone's behavior. It becomes the quiet hand on the wheel, or if pushed, the hand near the throat. Nuclear posture changes too. In our world, South Asia is a paired deterrence machine. India around 172 warheads, Pakistan around 170. Close enough that miscalculation is always one bad week away. In the no-partition world, that pairing disappears. Nuclear doctrine shifts away from neighbor-obsessed hair-trigger psychology and toward external peer deterrence, especially China, prioritizing survivability, second-strike security, and crisis stability. So by 2026, the comparison is simple. In our world, South Asia is 3 big states sharing one civilizational space, but paying the cost of partition every year. Duplicated institutions, duplicated militaries, duplicated crises, and permanent suspicion baked into the map. In this world, South Asia is one continental system, still messy, still unequal, still argumentative, but no longer paying to build the same future twice. Here's the line that sticks because it's true in the ugliest, most practical way. The most expensive thing partition created wasn't a border, it was a future purchased twice. And the ending has to be honest. A united India in 2026 isn't a clean win. It's a bigger stage for old human problems. Religious tension becomes permanently domestic. Language politics becomes a constant negotiation. Inequality stretches across a wider geography. But the world changes anyway because mass changes the rules. By 2026, the quiet question other powers ask isn't what does India want? It's what does India permit? Not in speeches. In trade routes, naval patrol patterns, energy security, supply chains, and which calls get answered first. All of it from one decision in 1947 that didn't happen, a line not drawn. And once you remove the machine that manufactures enemies by geography, the rest stops feeling like fantasy. It starts feeling like physics. So that's the world that emerges when one line is never drawn. No miracles, no utopia. Just a continent allowed to compound instead of fracture. A reminder that history isn't only shaped by revolutions or great men, but by the quiet decisions that don't happen, the borders that aren't drawn, the trains that don't become refugee convoys, the conflicts that never hard-code themselves into the map. If this made you rethink how fragile the modern world really is, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this is worth spreading. Subscribe if you want more deep-dive history like this, where small changes create massive consequences and the numbers actually matter. And drop a comment with what we should explore next. What if China never became communist? What if the Soviet Union reformed instead of collapsing? What if Africa industrialized first? What if the Ottoman Empire survived into the modern era? History is full of doors that almost stayed open. The next one is up to you.